Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be, and welcome to our panel on Bridging the Development Divide for a Fully Inclusive Trading System. I'm Inu Monik, Research Fellow at the Cato Institute's Herbert A. Stiefel Center for Trade Policy Studies, and I will be your moderator for this session. We will run the discussion for about 60 minutes, then open up for a Q&A for the audience. If you're tweeting during this event, please use the hashtag GTW2020 and ask us any additional questions we do not get to with the hashtag CatoTrade. I will do my best to answer all of them. So this panel was organized under the theme of rebooting the WTO. And we are going to discuss one of the more challenging issues for WTO reform, that is the grant of special and differential treatment to developing countries in the organization. I will begin with a bit of a background on special and differential treatment, where the WTO is actually a bit of an oddity among international organizations for how it handles developing countries. When the predecessor to the WTO, the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, was first created, there was no distinction made between developed and developing members. But as the membership expanded, it to include a greater number of developing countries. Sorry, I think we just got. Apologize for that. Let me begin again from the top. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be, and welcome to our panel on Bridging the Development Divide for a Fully Inclusive Trading System. I'm Inu Monik, Research Fellow at the Cato Institute's Herbert A. Stiefel Center for Trade Policy Studies, and I'll be your moderator for this session. We'll run the discussion for about 60 minutes, then open up to Q&A for the audience. If you're tweeting during this event, please use the hashtag GTW2020. And if you have any additional questions, please use the hashtag CatoTrade, and I'll do my best to answer them. This panel has been organized under the theme of rebooting the WTO, and we are going to discuss one of the more challenging issues for WTO reform, that is the grant of special and differential treatment to developing countries in the organization. I'm going to begin with a bit of background on special and differential treatment because the WTO is a bit of an oddity among international organizations for how it handles developing countries. When the predecessor to the WTO, the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, was first created, there was no distinction made between developed and developing members. There were growing calls, however, as that membership expanded to include a greater number of developing countries to address this divide. And as early as 1955, and for the first time, the members of the GATT introduced the concept of non-reciprocity, meaning that not every member would need to give in negotiations as much as it was going to get. And over the years, these issues became more prominent, though there was never an attempt by the WTO to define who qualified as a developing country. Thus, countries self-declare that they are developing. This means that they are developing countries if they say they are. Until very recently, for example, South Korea held on to its developing country status. But what do you get for being a developing country? Sometimes there is flexibility in the commitments you agree to as part of negotiations, longer time frames to implement the rules, and technical assistance, for example. These flexibilities are all decided in the context of negotiations. Now, when you raise the issue of special and differential treatment among government officials, most will have a strong opinion on it. But so many of the instinctual reactions on questions of SDT reform are steeped in what can best be described as a sort of mythology of its origin, purpose, and its effectiveness. Yes, differential treatment was born out of a sense of unfairness, that developed countries had a head start in industrialization, and that the developing world should be able to support their own infant industries to help them catch up. But this was not envisioned as a permanent state of affairs, and developing countries were expected to grow out of developing status. And yes, non-reciprocity was supposed to be a tool to speed this process along, but it too was not envisioned as a permanent exemption from the rules. And without a clear definition of what it meant to be a developing country, the practice of self-declaration has brought the purpose of special and differential treatment into question, when you have some advanced developing countries, for example, seeking to retain this status. But when we must operate in a system, when a country is developing when it says it is, we are left with a bit of a conundrum when countries that have a greater share of world trade or high GNI per capita, basically on par with developed countries, still consider themselves developing. Countries like Singapore, Hong Kong, Macau, Israel, the state of Kuwait, the UAE, Brunei Darussalam, and Qatar have been called out by the United States in particular as countries that should not be eligible for the same flexibility as, for example, those in sub-Saharan Africa, which in theory they can be treated as such for negotiating purposes. This state of affairs, ironically, has perhaps generated greater unfairness to the developing world. Now, developed countries are not off the hook, as they too have resisted opening their markets in areas where developing countries have a competitive advantage, such as in agriculture and textiles. But this is largely the product of embracing, perhaps too tightly, the concept of non-reciprocity, which has led to a situation where once we enter negotiations, WTO members are more concerned about how little they can give in terms of concessions than improving liberalization across the board. But this disadvantages the poorest members of the WTO because it takes the focus away from development and instead turns negotiations into battles over who is exempt from certain rules. Not meeting commitments does not help countries reach their development goals, and the special treatment that the WTO affords actually ends up backfiring. Now, in 2019, the United States put forward a proposal to address the development divide, but it began airing the antecedents of its current views in the issue in 1970s. So these concerns have a very long history. And the Trump administration has been more aggressive in its approach, but they have been able to restart an important conversation about differential treatment. And today, I am joined by a very distinguished panel to engage in this conversation and to help make sense of the development dimension at the WTO, and also to offer some thoughts on how we can build a more inclusive trading system. Now, the panelists don't really need an introduction, but I will go ahead and introduce them anyways. We are joined today by my colleague, James Backus, adjunct scholar at Cato the Institute, professor of global affairs, and director of the Center for Global Economic and Environmental Opportunity at the University of Central Florida, where he is a founding member also of the WTO's appellate body and twice served as chief judge. We are also lucky to be joined by Annabelle Gonzalez, non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, host of the Trade Winds webinar series, and former Trade Minister of Costa Rica. And to this lineup, I'm also thrilled to introduce Katrin Coleman, visiting professor of law at Georgetown University's Law Center, as well as president and founder of the New Markets Lab. Thank you all for being with us today. Let's dive right in. I'm going to start off actually with a question, and I'll direct it towards Jim. I mentioned that the Trump administration has been the most vocal as of late in reforming SDT. Do you think that their concerns are valid?
Our listeners may already know I'm not generally a supporter of President Trump's trade policies. In fact, I'm an ardent opponent. But in this case, I think the president is right that the members of the WTO need to address the central issue of the development dimension in trade rules. We need to address the issue of special and differential treatment if we hope to have any chance of anything approaching a grand global multilateral bargain on trade. That said, I think President Trump is right for the wrong reasons. Inu and I have engaged in a great deal of research on this topic. We've written a paper about it. It will be published in slightly different form as a book in the spring by Routledge Press. We've concluded that there really is no substantial empirical evidence that the United States or other developing countries, or other developed countries have suffered because developing countries have been given special and differential treatment. And this is true even of such countries as China. If you look at some research that has been done by our friends Henry Gao and Wei-Wan Zhou of Singapore and Australia, respectively, they've taken a close look at what has happened with respect to China, and they've concluded, I think correctly, that China has not really benefited, in particular, from special and differential treatment. Yet, President Trump is right that there are victims of special and differential treatment. And our conclusion is the victims of the developing countries themselves. Unfortunately, through the decades, special and differential treatment has increasingly become less about gradually integrating developing countries fully into the multilateral trading system and gradually getting to them to the point where they can capably fully comply with all WTO obligations. It's become more about maintaining and erecting barriers to their full participation and full integration in world trade. And this hurts them. It doesn't hurt the developed countries. Also, when we speak of development, I think we have to ask ourselves, what is development? What does it mean to develop economically? In the WTO debate, this has largely been a fairly rigid discourse about economic numbers, but I'm someone who believes that the proper view of development is the one voiced by Amartya Sen on any number of his publications, but especially in Development is Freedom, where he talks about development being a process of personal liberation, of increasing the choices that individual human beings have about how they wish to live. And if GDP numbers in their increases don't do that, then that's not development. And if trade barriers impede that process, then that's not a development. Development is an empowering process for individual human beings, and I think that the WTO, because it's by its own statement committed to sustainable development, must also be looking at development in this way. And I don't think this has been done in connection with the issue of special and differential treatment. And I have concluded that it should be. So I've given my due as best I can to President Trump. If you'd like to hear my long litany of ways in which I oppose him, we can save that for another day.
Thanks very much, Jim. And you raised a really good point about how we define what a developing country is. And my next question's for Annabelle on this, because part of the US proposal that I alluded to earlier sets a certain number of criteria for that it looks at, saying that if you're a member of the OECD, a member of the G20, a high income country as defined by the World Bank, or you account for 0.5% of global merchandise trade, that's how you should make the determination on claims of developing country status. So are these criteria useful? And how should we decide which countries get covered?
Thank you very much, Inu, for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm delighted to be here with you, with Jim, with Catherine, and with all our participants. So this proposal that the U.S. Submitted would catch some 30 countries in the context of the WTO, either because they are members of the G20 or members of OECD, or because they have 0.5% of participation in world merchandise trade, or because they are high-income countries according to the WTO. Now, the problem with this, or for that matter, any other criteria, is that it's tricky to find the right differentiation elements or criteria, if you wish. For example, under the US proposal, countries like India, Indonesia, or Vietnam would not be able to self-declare developing when they are clearly developing countries. So then you have, as a rebuttal to the US, China, India, and other countries presented a proposal in the WTO, making the point that per capita indicators should be used. But from an economic perspective, the issue is really whether a country is large enough in terms of world trade shares that its policy decisions can impact global prices. And this is actually the most important element. So agreeing on a formal WTO characterization of what is a developed or a developing country can become, in my view, a Byzantine exercise with little chance of success, given the huge diversity among developing countries. So to me, the issue is not that much who gets to call itself a developing country or not, but whether differentiation is actually occurring or can occur in practice. And here, and I'm sure that we're going to talk more about this, but we have, for instance, a very interesting sort of example, or actually sort of marks a way forward in the trade facilitation agreement, where we have that a number of so-called developing countries accepted to implement all commitments immediately. And even some of the larger emerging economies, such as China and Brazil, actually accepted to implement most of those commitments immediately. So differentiation is already happening in the context of the WTO. So maybe the way to go is not really try to identify a criteria for defining who's developing and who's not, but rather looking at each of the negotiations and trying to find differentiation based on each country's capacity to implement a particular provision.
Well, that's great. And actually, that alludes me to the paper that Jim and I recently put forward, where we also argue for an alternative approach that is based on a case-by-case sort of basis tied to specific development goals within negotiations. Now, I know Katrin has also advanced an argument that we need to construct trade rules in a certain way, focusing on a normative approach that may help with this. So Katrin, could you tell us how this differs from the current approach and how we might improve upon it?
Thank you so much, and it's wonderful to see everybody. Apologize, I had some technical difficulties, so I had to join by my phone. So hopefully this is working out okay. I first of all want to say that I really appreciated your paper, and James, and read it again as I was getting ready for our session today. I had built it into research that I also was doing on this topic earlier in the spring, and I have a paper coming out, I think within the next few days, in the Georgetown Journal of International Law on special and differential treatment, and this idea that maybe there could be a new normative approach that emerges that is much more rules-based than the approaches that we've seen in the past. So I agree with you completely that part of the challenge is that we have focused so much to date on exemptions from obligations, and that is not going to be a helpful approach going forward. But I think that my proposal takes it a step beyond just implementation of obligations, which I think has been another focus as we try to think about how we could make this more proactive, and really goes into affirmative design of the rules themselves. So in other words, in order to really understand how the rules could play a role and to use special and differential treatment within the realm of the rules, we need to think both about implementation of rules that have already been established and design of new rules going forward. And I think that many of the principles, I mean, James mentioned Amartya Sen's work. I think some of this amazing work that's out there on development could really apply in the context of how we craft the rules. So let me just say a little bit more about why this, how I came to this argument, and how I guess and what I see that goes into it. So about 5 years ago, I started looking at special and differential treatment, which really I think has just been a mainly defensive posturing so far. And I think that your article points that out as well. It's been mainly sort of a way to step back from the rules and to step back from the obligations and to try to carve out exceptions and exemptions. And sometimes that's absolutely needed. I mean, it's very true that in some cases it is difficult to take on a lot of obligations. And I think, though, that the rules are really at the heart of trade and at the heart of the WTO, the heart of any trade agreement. And so stepping back completely from the rules is not going to achieve the goals of the agreement. And particularly when we start to look at sustainable development, perhaps, which does include really making affirmative obligations in a number of different areas. But an effective system of rules has several different dimensions. One is the challenge that countries face in fulfilling the rules and integrating the rules into their own domestic legal systems. And I would say that part of, I think, what's happened here is that we have sort of missed some of the nuance of that in the discussion on special and differential treatment. It's actually a much more involved process than we have maybe given credit to in the way that special and differential treatment has been designed. But the other one, like I said, is the design of the rules themselves. So in many cases, the countries that have been seeking exemption from the rules didn't create the rules. They didn't help design the rules. And I think that's been part of the problem that we have faced, because if you don't have a hand in crafting the rules, then implementing them is going to be an even bigger challenge and is going to be something that sometimes is met with resistance. I worked as a trade negotiator from 1999 to 2005 and had a portfolio of countries that were undergoing significant transitions in their economic and legal systems. Many of them had, of course, just joined the WTO when it was created or were in the process of joining. So they weren't at the table when the rules were being set. And I think it was challenging for a lot of countries to comply with this vast new body of rules. In some cases, countries had to change dozens, if not hundreds of laws and subsidiary measures to comply. And even with SDT, that is a formidable challenge. So the way that SDT has been crafted doesn't really help us with that, to overcome some of those hurdles. In the past decade, then I've been looking at implementation from a different lens, spending a lot of time in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, looking at how agreements and rules are implemented. And capacity is part of it, but some of it just goes to the heart of rulemaking itself, which is how countries adapt and adopt rules and how they make them part of their domestic system and whether or not that process is participatory. So I think now we're faced with the challenge of how we go forward. How do we make sure that the global trading system can evolve to reflect the interests of 164 members, which is a huge difference from where we were before. And the WTFA, I think WTO TFA is an innovative model for sure. There's a lot that we can learn from the trade facilitation agreement. Flexibility, a differentiated way of applying the rules and adopting the rules. But trade facilitation, I think, is a little bit unique as well. It's a little bit more universal than some of the other areas of rules that we do need to start getting into more. And I think there are fewer differences in how countries approach it. So I would say, though, that we really need to start thinking about how we can shift into how a broader group of economies can shape the rules to serve their interests and needs, and how sustainable development, the SDGs, for example, different notions of development can be incorporated into that as we go forward. And it doesn't seem like the negotiating process has really allowed us to do this so far. There have been historical inequities as well, and differences in voice and participation in the system that we really need to take into account. And so recently I've been looking at much more closely at some of the African models, including the African Continental Free Trade Area, which I'll say more about in a little bit. But I think that these models actually show a different kind of flexibility, and that is a flexibility both in implementation of the rules, but it's also a flexibility in creation of the rules. And so I think that we need to incorporate that somehow into our notion of special and differential treatment as we go forward. So maybe I will leave it at that and say a little bit more about what those elements are of the African Continental Free Trade Area and some of the African regional economic communities in a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Katrin. And I actually want to stay on this point for a little bit, because I think envisioning an alternative approach is one of the most important things for how we move forward in the discussion on SDT. And so I want to sort of get Jim and Annabelle to weigh in, who in their own capacities in the past have done some crafting of rules. Jim in Congress and Annabelle as a trade negotiator knows a lot about how rules are negotiated. And I just would like to get your reactions on what Katrin is saying here about creating this more normative approach to dealing with creating no rules. So if you'd please chime in and let me know what you think.
Well, let me confess that before I was in the Congress, I too was a trade negotiator, which put me in difficulties in the realm of elected politics, because while in the Congress, I had the misfortune of having actually read the GATT, and so I knew that many of the proposals being made by my colleagues were illegal under international law. Not that that stopped them from advocating those proposals. I would very much like to see Catherine's article, not least because in the course of my current work in progress, I'm looking at what's happening in Africa. And I think Africa is distinctive right now in world trade. Globally, we are seeing a retrenchment, a turning inward, a turning away from more open trade and toward more economic nationalism, some of it increasingly virulent. Yet in contrast, in Africa, we're seeing an increasing trend of turning outward. I believe there are, Catherine can correct me, I believe there are 54 African countries involved in this African agreement, which I think takes effect next year. And they're lowering barriers to trade. Many of their trade barriers prohibit intra-African trade. That's going to be a tremendous economic boost to all those countries and to that continent. In terms of the more fundamental issues Catherine has raised, I'd like to see what she's actually proposing. Because newer members of the WTO were not members when just 23 countries, about half of them developing countries at the time, I should add, wrote the GATT back in, even before I was born. Does that mean that we should change national treatment now? I don't think so. Also, although these developing countries did not have the opportunity to draft these rules when they became members, whether in the 1990s and since the turn of the century, they have, by becoming members, become beneficiaries of all kinds of trade concessions that were made before they became members. And that's certainly worthwhile. I think this is why some of them persisted for years in trying to become members. And accession agreements do sometimes carve out exceptions. On the other hand, they do also sometimes specify that some developing countries that are acceding to membership assume more obligations than other developing countries have. This is certainly the case with China. The cases challenging some of China's export restrictions in terms of export taxes only exist because China included a list of products that it wouldn't tax in that way when it became a member of the WTO. Those obligations don't apply to other developing countries. I see this as a general problem in public international law. The WTO agreement is not the only treaty to which countries that were not a part of negotiating it later accede. Some allowance can be made at the time of accession, I think especially for transitional arrangements, and this is often done in the WTO, but I don't see any moral imperative to go back and renegotiate the original rules. Countries are not coerced into becoming members of the WTO. It's a practical matter. It's of a tremendous benefit to them that they do, but no one can make them join. Anyway, as I said, I'd like to see some of what Catherine is proposing. I certainly have an open mind on these issues. I'm Indu and I have made a proposal. I know she joins me in saying, let's really negotiate about this issue, try to find some common ground. We had all that much to our particular proposal. We're open to others. One last point, I was surprised, and I think Indu was as well, when we delved into this issue, at how little legal research and legal thought has been given to it. There were just a very few substantive articles on special and differential treatment, in contrast to 100,000 articles on national treatment. We were surprised by that, and thus our view that a lot of the assumptions about it are really based on memory or even mythology, as you put it, and not on reality. So this is, in addition to being an issue that needs to be negotiated, also an issue that needs to be researched, and more proposals are needed. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you. Annabelle, would you like to weigh in a bit on this issue as well?
Yeah, sure. Let me also mention that I like very much the paper that you and Jim wrote on this topic, and I think it proposes some interesting set of ideas for the way forward. Let me maybe start by saying that trade is a very powerful tool to create prosperity. We have seen it, for example, in East Asia, with a country like Vietnam, reducing extreme poverty to single digits in less than 30 years, which is something quite impressive by all standards. If anything, developing countries need to integrate further into the global trading system to be able to have more growth opportunities. That is certainly the case of African countries, for example, who up until today trade still very little with other countries and within themselves. So active engagement in the multilateral trading system would bring to these countries the benefits of contractually based, non-discriminatory liberalization, stability, and predictability. So the rationale for joining the system and complying by the rules is very strong. Now, having said this, it is also true that particularly smaller and poorer nations may lack the ability to effectively negotiate and implement trade agreements and to leverage the opportunities of international trade. So this is where I do think there is a strong rationale for providing some kind of, if we want to call it, special and differential treatment. But at the end of the day, in my view, it's mostly capacity building to be able to implement the agreements and to take advantage of the agreements, which is even more difficult if you wish, but also longer transition periods in order to be able to build this capacity. So capacity building and longer transition periods, in my view, are not only do they have a strong rationale, but they're actually indispensable in many ways if you want developing countries to be able to effectively trade more. Now, other types of provisions, it would depend on the negotiating, specific negotiation. I'd be open to hear what some of these approaches could be, but I would be very cautious about possibilities of exempting countries from specific rules, because this is just a way, in most cases, to exempt themselves from the benefits of the system. And I don't think, again, that is what we would like to see. Thank you.
Thanks, Annabelle. That's a great point, this idea of how the rules have sort of created these exemptions in a sense. And what we've seen over time, STT has gradually transformed from the early days of the GATT to how it's practiced today. Each of you has alluded to, in one way or another, the TFA, which took a really novel approach to addressing STT. So I wonder, right now, are we at another critical juncture where we're going to see a change to the way STT is actually provisioned envisioned with specific challenges do we face, I guess, in maybe getting every WTO member on board to update these rules? Because we are seeing some momentum to change them, but how do we get a more significant overhaul of this? Maybe I'll start with Jim and have you each sort of respond to that.
I shall in a moment. Paul, I wanted to say I agree with all that Annabelle just said. And I think she would join me, she can correct me if I'm mistaken, in adding that there's very little sentiment among developed countries for imposing stringent obligations on the least developed countries in the world, which would include many countries in sub-Saharan Africa. If capacity building is a problem everywhere in the developing world, it's certainly a problem there. And I think Catherine is right. Beyond capacity building, there's the broader issue of compliance with the rule of law. Now, here in my own country now, even after 250 years, we're having some struggles with continuing to uphold the rule of law. And I think it's a problem increasingly in even the most developed parts of the world. And it's still more of a problem when countries are asked to comply with the international rule of law when they don't even have the domestic rule of law or the legal architecture in place in their own countries to help uphold it. And so I think Catherine made an outstanding point there that needs to be considered going forward. Now, in answer to your question, I see this issue as central to any hope of any meaningful multilateral trade agreement. I'm hoping, as many are, that come 2021, we'll have a turnabout in the world. We'll begin to control this terrible pandemic. We may have more enlightened leadership in important parts of the world. There may be an opportunity to move ahead in trade, and in doing so, save a global trading system that I think is grave risk right now. And the elements of a bargain are in place. They've long been in place, but there's never been the political will to achieve them. As Inu mentioned at the outset, developing countries have a comparative advantage in textiles, agriculture, and some other aspects of world trade, and they've been denied this comparative advantage by protectionist trade barriers in the United States, Europe, and elsewhere. At the same time, there are still in manufacturing some high tariffs, particularly in developing countries, tariff peaks and escalation in developed countries. Huge barriers to trade in services, which comprise most of the economy of developed countries. There's the opportunity to eliminate all these barriers and create many benefits, as Annabelle said, for everyone. But I don't see how we can hope to achieve this bargain unless we come to some common ground on this issue of the development divide between the North and the South. This is a central issue. It's a pivotal issue. If we could reach some agreement, I think it would open the door to other things, and perhaps also open the door to much else that the WTO needs to be done to modernize and come fully into the 21st century. Commercial issues such as digital trade, intellectual property, investment facilitation, as well as trade facilitation, competition policy, and much more. And also, in my view, I'm speaking here for myself, the I haven't discussed all these issues, but as I've written in other places, I think we need to modernize WTO rules in part by reconciling them with the realities of climate change and the other ecological challenges we face as a world. And so that issues are such as climate change, forest loss, water supply, wildlife trade, and on, need to be brought fully within the WTO negotiating agenda. And again, I don't see this as being possible unless we can have some positive reckoning with the issue of special and differential treatment. I especially, just from the local perspective of U.S. politics, irrespective of who's president, I don't see the United States being in a position to negotiate on some of the important concessions we should make to the rest of the world, unless developing countries are willing to acknowledge that there's a difference between Brazil or China or India and some of the poorest island states and poorest countries in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. I just don't see that happening.
Thanks, Jim. And actually, you raised an interesting point that makes me want to sort of to shift and reframe the question a bit for Annabelle as well, because when you think about creating the positive framework from which we can start discussions on reforming SDT, one of the challenges that we even noted in our own research was that you have 183 provisions in the WTO agreements that provide for special and differential treatment. And yet, when you ask government officials about the benefits, they often struggle to identify a specific provision that has impacted their development outcomes, as you've mentioned as well. So what exactly, I guess, is my question is, what are the benefits of SDT that some countries are so adamant about preserving, and how do we get over this political hurdle? Maybe Annabelle, if you want to take that, I'd be interested to hear what you think about this, because it's a big pressing challenge of just this political obstacle that we just can't seem to get over.
I would start by saying that I agree with Jim that unless this issue is tackled in the system, it will be very difficult to make progress. I don't think this is a question of particular U.S. administration. I think this is a broader sort of views in most advanced countries, that larger players, there's this very strong rationale to have larger players play by the same rules. I think a point well made is that this is not, we're not talking here about least developed countries. That is the only category that is explicitly recognized in the WTO, as we know. And I think the underlying thinking there is that in the process of institutional building, there are some priorities that these countries need to address, and then that is why we sort of protect them in that special category until they move out of the category of least developed countries. Now, I think that, as I was saying, there is rationale for longer transition periods and for capacity building. So I think that could be part of the system. Another element, I don't think there's one single way to find a solution out of this conundrum, but one is the capacity building and the transition periods. Another one is this self-decision not to claim differentiated treatment. We have seen this with Korea, I think you were mentioning it, or Singapore, more recently Brazil, for example. We can also, another way of looking at this is self-decision not to claim differentiated treatment in a specific negotiation, as in TFA, but there may be others in going forward. Another option for looking into this issue is the flexible negotiating options, such as the plurilateral agreements, flexible formats that allow countries to come in and participate while leaving it open for other members to join is also another way of addressing this. And finally, I think one reason why many countries prefer to put the FDT sort of exemption out there and not engage is concerned as to whether they will actually be able to engage in the negotiation, whether they will be able to effectively negotiate, and whether there can be well-designed provisions that consider these challenges that many of these countries face. So thinking about strengthening the capacity of developing countries to engage in negotiations, I think is something that can also be very, very critical. I have to say that, I come from a developing country. I participated in many negotiations, and there is concern about how some of these provisions, may impact the country, or most frequently about what is the political economy as regards some of these provisions. But in my view, using this as a way to exempt from the rules, again, is something that only backfires and that keeps, in a way, the issues that are important to developing countries out of the negotiating table. And we've discussed the case of agriculture, for example. In agriculture, we have an agreement on agriculture that made some important progress in the context of the establishment of the WTO. But for sure, improved disciplines are needed in the area of agriculture. But if developing countries do not engage in that negotiation, well, it's unlikely that that negotiation will render provisions that are in their interest. So I really want to make sort of like a very strong plea for engaging in negotiations to defend, each country's interest or coalitions of countries' interest, and discussing in the context of those negotiations what are the types of provisions that are appropriate for different countries, rather than bringing in this very broad sort of upfront category requesting exemptions that basically isolates developing countries.
Thank you. Actually, and that perfectly sort of segues into my next question, because you mentioned asking what are the types of provisions that are appropriate in negotiations, and I think one of the reasons that we've had such resistance to SDT, to reforming it, is that sometimes it's easier to stick with what you already have than to redesign decades of existing practice. But I think maybe we're not just shooting in the dark right now, are we? And I want to kind of turn to Katrin here to sort of talk about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, because this agreement has structured rules that address the development dimension in a more proactive way. And I wonder if this is a model we can learn from and build upon in thinking about SDT reform at the WTO.
Thank you. And I'd like to respond to a few of the comments that have been made too, both by Annabelle and James, as I kind of lead into that discussion. One is what Annabelle was just saying about flexible negotiating options. I think that probably needs to be one of our main areas of focus going forward. That is one of the hallmarks of the African Continental Free Trade Area, is flexibility. And this is something that we've seen in African regional trade agreements as well. It is a different approach somewhat, and I'll explain this in a minute, that builds on itself a bit more. And we maybe need to go back to that a little bit more in negotiations more broadly, and also in the WTO. But I just wanted to highlight, I think that flexibility is critical. And to me, I think that's one of the reasons that so many countries have wanted to maintain special and differential treatment, even though it has had so many challenges, is because it seems to be a way of having more flexibility in approaching the rules and these very complex obligations sometimes. But I agree with both Annabelle and James that we do not want to undermine the rules. We need the rules in the system. And again, my research has really focused also on how could we have a much more proactive approach that is focused on using those rules to unlock all of the potential of trade and not on stepping back from them. But I want to go back to something else that James said too, which is that given everything that's going on right now in the world and looking at how different countries are reacting and how they are approaching trade, I think that what's happening in Africa is tremendously exciting. I really do think that if you look at the statements that have been made by African officials since the pandemic started, all of it has been about this trade is going to be the key to moving forward from this crisis. Trade is the way forward for us. And we don't see that everywhere. So I do think that that also, just that overall approach on trade is something that is really fundamental. But let me talk a little bit about the AFCFTA just to kind of give a little bit of flavor of why I think that it's such an interesting model. And then I'll just mention briefly at the end too where my research is going now, because I would really love to have a broader discussion on some of this. I think it's incredibly important. And I think, as you all pointed out too, we need more research in these areas. We need more focus on this. This is going to be an absolutely critical issue going forward. So there are a couple of things that I think that make the AFCFTA really noteworthy. One is its flexible approach, and I'll explain what I mean by that, based on variable geometry. And it's an incremental approach to building the rules over time. And it's not unlike some of the approaches that we've seen in the multilateral system in the past either. So the second is a differentiated approach, which really does remind me of the recommendations in your paper, and James, and it's tailored to, though, a broader set of things than just economic factors, economic, geographic, even legal circumstances. And so the AFCFTA really recognizes that countries do have different circumstances in these areas, and that it needs to be a more tailored approach. SDT is still in there, but if you look at the AFCFTA too, it's built on a lot of the fundamental principles of trade law. So it doesn't deviate from the way that we think about trade law, MFN and national treatment. And it has some, there are some different takes on some things, also because of the circumstances that Africa is in with the regional economic communities, but it builds on some of these, and even in some cases takes a lot of inspiration from WTO agreements in some of the substantive areas. The other thing that I think is noteworthy, though, is that it really does focus on sort of a development-driven approach to law. And it's interesting that the AFCFTA, so let me talk about the flexibility first in the structure, and then I'll explain what I mean a little bit more by that, and why I think that it might be a model that sort of leads us into how to apply trade rules in a way that really advances the sustainable development goals. So this flexible approach, as I said, is based on variable geometry, and this is something that we see in African trade agreements more broadly. It's progressive, it's incremental, there's a framework agreement, and then pieces are built on top of it. So it's not everything done all at once. The agreement itself has gone into effect. It's becoming operational, though, as countries agree on the kind of nuts and bolts, the goods and services negotiations and some things that go along with that. That was meant to happen by July. It's been postponed to beginning of January because of the pandemic. And then the agreement goes into really a negotiation of these substantive rules areas. So it will start with intellectual property, competition, and investment. Several of the areas that James mentioned as being priority, and areas in some cases where we really don't have yet a full set of rules at the multilateral level. Then there has been an announcement as well that the next stage after that will be on digital regulation. And part of that, I think, is just recognizing the role that digital regulation plays in the global economy. I think part of it is also seeing what's happening with the pandemic and how everything has been digitized. I mean, we're, doing things in a much different way than we did a year ago. So, and I think one of the other things, as I mentioned too, the AFCFTA really does also build on the progress that has been made in the regional economic communities, and doesn't seek to completely harmonize everything. I mean, it does intend to pull it together, but if you look at the provisions in there, and my paper goes into this in a lot more detail, it's not meant to make everything completely standard, which I think is also quite interesting. Or at least it's going to be very challenging, I think, to do that. So then I mentioned the differentiated approach, and this pops several places in the agreement and the protocol on trade and goods, protocol on trade and services. I won't read a lot of the language, but I just want to highlight a couple of things. Different levels of economic development or that have individual specificities. It's very much aligned with this differentiated approach that you have proposed. In the Protocol on Trade and Services, it recognizes least developed, landlocked, island states, and vulnerable economies, really taking that recognition of vulnerable and states and smaller economies, and putting it into the language of the agreement. And then also in the protocol on trade and services, the language says grant flexibilities such as transitional periods on a case-by-case basis to accommodate special economic situations and development, trade, and financial needs of the parties, which I think goes beyond how we have looked at special and differential treatment in the past. So I feel like this agreement is really kind of a, it sort of highlights some of the things that we're talking about in this panel, and will be a real way of testing some of this going forward. Now, I mentioned that I think that it's also very designed to kind of be an affirmative, proactive way of leading development and law in these different areas. And I think that it is not an accident that the areas that are identified for the next stage of negotiation are areas in which the multilateral or the global system hasn't really yet developed a set of rules. This is a chance for Africa, I think, to decide how they want the rules to look, how countries want the rules to look. Of course, some of the same challenges with integrating the positions of larger economies and smaller economies will still exist. But I think it is very, I think it's really hopeful, and I think it's really exciting. And I think that it, most likely, and in the paper that I wrote, I go into this in more detail, looking at what the trends are already in these different areas of law and what possibly a negotiation might encompass. But I would think that some of the things like on IP, for example, that there will be more recognition of the need to look at indigenous rights and biodiversity and some of the things where we do have some disciplines internationally, but more work is needed. On investment, I think this is going to reflect some of these larger trends on investment to kind of step away from the way things have been done, and look for kind of a new path forward. And then competition, it's a little harder to say, because I think competition law is an area where not every country has really decided how they want to regulate. I think the same is true somewhat on digital, but this is part of where I'm trying to take my research now, is to really look at where some of these flexibilities have existed and how different countries have regulated, and try to see what might be possible going forward. So, and I think finally, I would say that, I mean, the AFCFTA does reference sustainable development. The WTO also references sustainable development, but I think that it has a little bit more of a mechanism for really achieving that. It will have to go beyond where it is now. It will have to go beyond where it's envisioned going now to really take on, I think, a sustainable development in the SDGs in a completely meaningful way. But I think that the agreement sets the stage for reshaping the rules. And I think probably more broadly than just Africa, I think it also incorporates this kind of needed refresh of special and differential treatment. And again, I think that has to be a much bigger conversation. And I agree with many of the things that have been raised today. And I hope that it's a way to kind of close the loop a little bit more between development and trade rules. So it's a really interesting model, and one that I think also bears more, should be studied and really focused on much more. And like I said, I'm expanding my research to go into some of the flexibilities that exist already in trade agreements and different models, and to try to understand a little bit better what we might expect going forward.
Thank you, Katrin. That's a fascinating look at something that I think deserves far more attention than we're currently giving it in this debate and in this discussion. So I'm actually going to turn to Q&A in a second, and I'm going to give Annabelle and Jim a chance to respond first before we do that. But just for the audience, if you could please submit your questions, I'll queue them up in the chat box, and I'll get through them one by one. So first, I invite Annabelle and Jim to sort of respond to Katrin's argument here for looking at the AFCFTA.
Thank you very much. Oh, I'm sorry. You want to come in, Jim?
No, go ahead.
So just to say two things. One is, I think the AFCFTA is a wonderful achievement. It's true, and Jim was mentioning this before, that as many countries in the world are going the protectionist route, African countries are looking at igniting trade, liberalizing trade, reducing trade costs, defragmenting borders, and others. And I think that if properly implemented, the CFTA can be a powerful tool to develop regional value chains within Africa, and I think that this is very powerful. Now, the second point that I wanted to make is that I think in considering the CFTA, but also in considering other agreements, including in the context of the WTO, it's important to bring in the lens of global value chains. Because global value chains represent today over half of world trade, and they have become a very important ladder for many developing countries to move out of poverty, to grow, to create jobs. Now, we know that global value chains are facing challenges on several fronts, the technology front, the policy front, and others. But still, I believe that they can be a powerful instrument for many developing countries to integrate in global trade. But in order for that to happen, evidence has shown that there needs to be a set of provisions that underpin global value chains. And these types of provisions normally involve not only sort of like our more sort of regular standard provisions applicable to trading goods, but also include elements of investment, trading services, intellectual property, even things like visas to be able to move personnel from firms from one country to another. So having said this, I think that in crafting new rules, one way to be friendly to development is to look at them from the GVC lens to make sure that developing countries can continue to integrate into global value chains, particularly though in those parts of the world like Africa or Latin America, or even to a certain extent South Asia, that either have been engaged only in low value chains or who have not engaged at all yet in global value chains.
I have just two brief points I'd like to add before we go to questions in response to Inu's suggestion. First, I see a certain historic irony in the fact that the United States especially, but all developed countries, have been lecturing the African countries for decades about how they need to embrace freer trade. And they're now showing us how to do it at a time when we're retreating from it. And that's a sad state of affairs, but we certainly need to commend the African countries. Second, I simply want to underscore what I said earlier about sustainable development in light of Catherine's emphasis on the fact that trade must not only accommodate, and certainly must not impede sustainable development, but trade rules must become an affirmative way of advancing sustainable development. I've written a whole book about this, which, by the way, will come out in paperback next month from Cambridge. So I've learned a lot from listening to both Annabelle and Catherine today. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you, Jim. I'm going to get to some questions here that are already queued up. And one that we just saw here asks if we could please share our observations on the implication of some developing countries foregoing SDT while maintaining their developing country status. Now, this is something that we dig into in our paper as well, looking at the relationship between what developing country status actually is and then what SDT is, which are different and distinct. So I'll let one of you take over and respond to that and describe what that distinction is and what it means if we pursue an alternative approach, as Katrin has mentioned, where we look at the specific obligations, why this distinction doesn't really matter. Please, maybe Annabelle or Jim, if you want to jump in, or Katrin.
I'll start this time, Annabelle. And I go back to something Inu said, which we also said in our Cato paper. If you ask developing countries to give you some concrete examples of how they have benefited specifically through the years from special and differential treatment, and they have a hard time finding an example to give you an answer. So I don't think these countries are giving up all that much by saying that in forthcoming negotiations, for example, they won't be asserting their right to declare status as a developing country. I think in part it's a political move on their part and a wise one, I should add. There's no way that South Korea is a developing country. they're, they're significantly more advanced than quite a few European countries at this point. As for Brazil, the same holds true. One thing we haven't discussed that I'd like to mention is, but we talk about it in our paper, and I know Annabelle has written specifically about this, and we quote her on this in our paper, is the fact that it's possible to be developed, so to speak, in one sector, but not be developed in others. And in advocating a case-by-case approach, Inu and I have cited a sectoral approach on a case-by-case basis is one way of proceeding. Certainly, Brazil has some development challenges still ahead, but are they really not developed agriculturally? Are they not developed in terms of producing commercial aircraft? I would say that Embraer is pretty good at it. The opportunity is there to make these distinctions as we begin to try to make them. And here too, I think flexibility is the key. Annabelle?
Yeah, I think I would agree with you, Jim, in the sense that, to me, the question of what are the most appropriate rules in the context of the negotiation should be negotiated in that context. I don't think that coming out with a banner that says FDT, even before negotiations have begun, really makes a lot of sense. So to me, these countries like Brazil, Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, and my own country, Costa Rica, basically have agreed to say, so we will not, we will not bring in SDT in the context of future negotiations. But this doesn't mean that these countries may not need, as you said, in a particular sector, in a particular negotiation, in a particular context, they may not need longer transition periods. They may, or they may need capacity building as well. And I don't think that they're renouncing to that. They're just saying, and they're not by virtue of that, they're certainly not saying we are developed. Because as you say, I mean, development is a very complex concept. And in a way, if someone were to ask me, is Costa Rica a developed country? My answer is no. Costa Rica is not a developed country. However, does this mean that by agreeing not to present or request FDT as such in the context of negotiations, will this in any way change Costa Rica's development status? No. But it means that the country is ready to engage further in a context of a particular negotiation. And it may be that in a certain context, it does not need any technical capacity building, or it does not need any transition period, or it does not need any other flexibility. But it can be very well be that in others it does. The issue is how to negotiate the context of a particular negotiation.
Thank you, Annabelle. And Katrin, do you want to weigh in on this question as well?
Just very briefly, because I think it's been covered so well already. And I will say I completely agree with what James said. Flexibility is key. I think flexibility is going to be the lens that we apply going forward in just about every country's case, because I think every country is going to be facing challenges from this point out. And we are going to have to think of different ways maybe to approach some of these systems and these rules with that in mind. So I think, and I also want to say too, I do think that there is a big distinction, I was going to say this earlier, between countries that we've just been talking about too, that really have, you know, very different, you know, a very different economic landscape than some of the, you know, small and vulnerable economies. I think really it's this, again, these distinctions between countries and ways of really differentiating, which, you know, I'm glad that your work has focused so heavily on that, because I think that's going to be really incredibly important. And I just want to say then one last thing too, which is that I do think that sometimes we even need to think about within a country, whether, you know, where there are pockets of, even if a sector appears to be developed on its face, there might still be a very significant impact on a certain part of the population by, you know, deciding how some of these measures are going to play out. So we probably need to take our differentiation a little bit deeper too than we have in the past, and really think about income distribution, think about, you know, level of industrialization, which I think we've talked about, the size of the informal sector, the size of the agricultural sector, resource endowments, proximity to ports, even conflict status. I mean, I think some of these things are really going to also play a role as we try to figure out how to differentiate further. But flexibility, flexibility, flexibility. I agree.
Thank you, Katrin. I have another question here from Anna, who asks, how could developing countries increase their influence on decision-making and rule-making? Do soft law instruments do more harm than good in that regard? And maybe, Katrin, if you want to start here, because, you know, you talked a lot about the need for capacity building and how you craft these rules. So what do you think about this?
Well, I think that there's a huge opportunity right now for a broader group of countries to exert their influence over the system, which I think is actually good. I mean, you probably can tell by my comments. I think this is a good thing. I think we're heading into a different phase where maybe, you know, maybe we can have these discussions in a broader way. And but again, I do take a lot of the points that Annabelle and James have made as well with all of their experience, and I don't think that it's going to sort of play a big role. I think soft law is something where we have seen substantive rules advance through a soft law approach. Financial law, for example. I mean, there are some really, again, interesting examples that we can learn from, I think, in the trade context too. And I think part of the other way that countries will be able to exert an influence is by working together through models like the AFCFTA and others to really decide, again, affirmatively decide, what do we want the rules to look like? How, you know, what kind of proposals do we want to put forward? And I think it'll be really interesting to see how that changes some of these conversations going ahead, hopefully still, you know, keeping the principles of the system that have been, you know, made it work so well, I think, for all of these years. So I'm a big believer in, you know, kind of combining what we have had with the future possibilities, and I think soft law is definitely an example of a place. I think it depends on how it's developed and how it's applied, but I just think that law is evolving in so many different ways right now, and it's not really just kind of a linear traditional approach any longer.
You know, 2 points. Just following on Catherine, I too believe in the importance of soft law. Unfortunately, the Trump administration believes that the WTO agreement is soft law, and that you can choose to comply with it or not, depending on the circumstances. Just a political observation there, but also a legal one. I think that there is much potential within the WTO for sort of quasi soft law in the form of guidelines that might be appended to various forms of plurilateral or multilateral agreement. For example, we have the annex in the subsidies agreement that contains an illustrative list of export subsidies. not exhaustive, but illustrative. And in terms of telecommunications, we also have some guidelines. I think there is potential to do more there, including in special and differential treatment, as Inu and I have proposed in our paper. And my second and final point is this, and it's a jurisprudential one in part, under the Westphalian system with which we're all familiar, that still guides international law. International law is law between and among nation states. And in this law, legally, every nation state is equal, practically, because of economic and military and other reasons. This is not always the case in practice by any means. But in a legal institution, it's supposed to be. And now that the developing countries compose not only a majority, but a goodly majority of the members of the WTO, I think they have the collective clout to make certain their views are heard. I haven't heard them shying away from expressing their views lately. I don't think developed countries have quite come to terms with this, but this is the 21st century. It's no longer the 20th century. Dating back to the Marshall Plan and to the formation of the Bretton Woods institutions, including the GATT that became the WTO, we always said that our goal was for the rest of the world to develop and prosper and progress and succeed. Well, it's doing so. And I think that's in the best interest of the countries such as the United States that helped create the system in the first place. But politically, we're still having a hard time coming to terms with that. I think by the same token, developing countries are still mired to some extent in the past. They still see themselves as victimized, which they were in many instances, and they still see themselves psychologically as not having the collective clout that they do. And it's important that they speak up more in the multilateral system. I would like to see China be more assertive in the WTO, not less so. And I'd like to see other developing countries do the same. And I think that's beginning to happen. But whatever a country calls itself, they are legally an equal participant in the multilateral trading system. And they all have to come to terms with the reality of the century in which we live and where it seems to be going, whether it's in climate change, whether it's in growing inequality, whatever it may be. Certainly the pandemic makes this clear. We need more international cooperation, not less.
Thank you, Jim. And it makes me think of one of the big challenges in reform is that the context in which we do so is under negotiation. And we really haven't had any successful multilateral negotiations in quite some time, as you all know. We're trying to do a multilateral negotiation in fisheries, which I think is something that a lot of these discussions are going to hinge on. But Annabelle also mentioned that there's a chance in plurilaterals to actually make some headway. And we have a question from Wilhelmina about this, and she asks, if there's a risk that the plurilateral approach could further entrench a two-tier system at the WTO that leaves some developing countries behind and fails to effectively integrate them into the system if they don't get on board with these rules. So maybe, Annabelle, if you wanted to start answering that, I'd appreciate it.
Well, I think that there is indeed a risk, and this is why it's very important that plurilateral agreements are open to all members. And this is, to me, this plurilaterals cannot be closed clubs. they need to be open to everyone. And again, I would insist that for developing countries to be able to effectively participate and take advantage of these agreements and properly implement them, the capacity building element needs to be much stronger. So to me, plurilaterals is also a way of reigniting the system so it can deliver on one of its main functions. You mentioned, Ina, that it has been a while since we haven't since we have agreed on a multilateral agreement, and it is important because we need at this time, in the context of COVID-19, in the context of the global recession that we are facing, we need a multilateral trading system that is effective. And one way to reignite one of the key functions of the WTO is through plurilaterals. Now, if we look at some of the joint initiatives that are being negotiated in the context of the WTO, be it on digital trade, for instance, or on investment facilitation, to take this too, we see a significant participation in developing countries because many developing countries, of course, understand the importance of investment facilitation, talking about integrating into global value chains, for example, as I was saying before, investment facilitation can play a critical role there. And that I think is why we see such an active participation. But likewise, on digital trade, developing countries know that the future of trade very much lies in digital trade. So they want to be part of those negotiations. So to me, again, the key is keep it open and also support, continue support in developing countries with capacity building and technical assistance.
Thank you, Annabelle. And I think we're getting close to the end, but I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative to ask my own question here. Because, you know, when you think about what's going on with the SDT reform debate, like all the WTO reform issues, many think that this will blow over, that this is an issue that will not become topical or continue to be interesting and on the table once the Trump administration, for example, leaves office, because they raised it quite significantly in the context of broader reform. Now, what do you all think about this? Do you think that this is something that we can just put aside and maybe, you know, developing countries don't really have to engage in these debates and can just wait out for a new administration? Or is this something that is going to be sticking around with us for a while? And if so, how can developing countries really engage to make this the best possible reform that's going to help them really integrate into the trading system? Annabelle, maybe.
The discussion around FTT will not go away. Actually, as in order to make progress in revitalizing the WTO, this is one issue that needs to be tackled. As we have discussed today under your excellent guidance, Inu, there are many different alternatives to address this topic. This in no way means not recognizing the needs of different groups of countries, but also we need to make progress on this front to make sure that the WTO can continue to deliver for the benefit of both advanced and developing countries.
Anyway, for my part, I would say we need to consider a scenario in which Joe Biden wins the election in a few weeks and also becomes president. They're not necessarily one and the same thing, I'm afraid. But let's assume that happens. I have no idea who his USTR will be, or who will be general counsel to USTR, or who will be the ambassador to the WTO for the United States in Geneva. But I can guarantee you the position of the United States will be pretty much word for word what was in the proposal that was submitted by USTR to the WTO last February. That's not going to change. And as Annabelle said, this is a core issue. It's a central issue that must be confronted by all the members of the WTO to be able to go forward.
Catherine?
Well, I agree. I don't think this issue is going to go away. I mean, in fact, I think that this conversation that has now kind of come to the fore has been simmering for a very long time in different ways. So I think that we're going to have to find some ways to move forward from it. And I think that as our discussion here highlighted, and I really want to thank you again to Inu for moderating such a great session, and to Annabelle and James for the fantastic discussion. I hope this is a conversation that can keep going with many others involved, because I think there are so many different dimensions to the development dimension. I think it is something that has so many different facets, and we really need to be thinking about all of those, particularly again, as we all go into a period where things are much less certain in ways than they were before. And so I think this idea of flexibility is going to be one that keeps coming up as well. As I mentioned, I'm pursuing some new research in that area that I'm excited to share soon. And I hope that we can maybe kind of find ways to talk about special and differential treatment and development in a broader context, because it really is something that impacts us all. So thank you again for a great session.
Well, thank you. And I think that's all the time we have, even though I think we can sit here and talk about this pretty much the entire day. We do have to stop. So I want to take a moment to thank you, our panel, Jim, Annabelle, Katrin, for your insights. This has been really enlightening and an interesting discussion. And to thank also the audience for joining us today. And a special shout out actually to one of my friends in New Zealand and those like her who woke up in the middle of the night actually to tune in. So good morning to you as well. So we hope the rest of you enjoy the rest of Geneva Trade Week, and thank you so much for joining us today.